Welcome to part 4 of our 9-week series honoring the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations and their 25-year history of work. On this program, you'll see years 1987 through 1991 that was taped 14 years ago, and then starting next week, we'll have updates for the last 15 years.
These positive efforts by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations did not go unnoticed or unanswered by the Aryan nations.
And again, in March of 1986, a pipe bomb exploded at the automotive repair shop in Hayden, Idaho. In July of 1986, Aryan Nation Congress held in Idaho. The main theme of the conference is the establishment of a 5-state white homeland in the Northwest. In August 1986, a pipe bomb explodes at another automotive repair shop near Hayden, Idaho. Also in August of 1986, counterfeit $20 notes were passed at county fairs in Idaho and Washington. Aryan Nations members were arrested and released on bond. In early September 1986, a pipe bomb explodes at the home of Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations leader, Father Bill Wasmuth. Late September, 3 more pipe bombs explode in Coeur d'Alene, the downtown area. A 4th bomb is found unexploded.
The small town of Coeur d'Alene reeled under the emotional impact of the bombings, but her people stood firm.
The bonding that occurred as a result of the bombing of Father Bill's house was strong. The feeling was akin to that of a close-knit but very independent family. We went our own separate ways until one of us was threatened from the outside, and then we would come together for strength and support. At no time was this more apparent than after the bombing. The community showered words of support and concern through phone calls and notes of encouragement to Father Bill. Shock and outrage emanated through the local communities like a shock wave from an earthquake, with Father Bill's house as the epicenter. State and local law enforcement agencies and the FBI immediately started a very intense investigation into the bombing. People in the community again felt touched by the Aryan movement. One of our own had been threatened. Bill was, of course, very shaken by the bombing, but unwavering in his determination to see the task force ideas through. His sense of humor again surfaced, which helped to ease the tension. Law enforcement officials were very concerned that good people would take law into their own hands in retaliation. There was talk of leveling the Aryan Nations compound with tractors. These actions, besides being unlawful, could lead to more violence and possible bloodshed. Under Sheriff Larry Broadbent voiced his concerns on this issue at a special task force board meeting following the bombing. The idea for a gathering for solidarity was born to show community support for Father Bill, for our minority neighbors, and to ease the friction in the community in general.
The gathering took place on Thursday, September 25th, 1986, at North Idaho College. It was about 10 days after the bombing of Father Bill's house. It had a profound effect on many who attended.
The room was filled to overcapacity with a crowd of about 700 people from North Idaho and Eastern Washington. A format of quiet reassurance through songs, many from the Civil Rights era, non-denominational prayer, candle lighting ceremony, and an Indian prayer for strength from the four winds to our community, danced by a Native American board member, formed the evening. Idaho Governor John Evans asked to be on the program. His brief address provided assurance and a deep concern for us. Father Bill's remarks, although brief, were heartfelt. In attendance was Aryan Nations leader Richard Butler and a companion from the compound. They were allowed to stay as long as they minded their manners. Father Bill said that the evening was a very strong source of support for him. I feel I need to add that the task force could never, nor would never, have attempted the rallies, the meetings, and the gatherings that we did with the public if it had not been for the support and the encouragement from the law enforcement side of our community. Without that, it would have been far too dangerous to our community people to hold the group activities that we did.
The year 1986 ended on a very significant note for human rights. I, as mayor of Coeur d'Alene, was informed that the city would be the first United States recipient of the Raoul Wallenberg Civic Award. The award is given by the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of the United States, which is a non-profit organization established to educate the public about Raoul Wallenberg, whose heroic efforts in Hungary during World War II saved the lives of over 100,000 Jews. The Swedish citizen was eventually arrested by Soviet troops and condemned to a Soviet gulag. Although his whereabouts today are unknown, he has been made an honorary citizen of the United States. The committee was created in order to generate national recognition for Raoul Wallenberg and to bring attention to his fate. Whenever possible, the committee also comes to the aid of persons or causes dedicated to the same principles and ideals personified by Raoul Wallenberg and to grant scholarships in his name. I was honored to accept, along with Father Bill Wasmuth and Larry Broadbent, the Raoul Wallenberg Award for all the courageous citizens of the city of Coeur d'Alene and Kootenai County during days of remembrance celebration in New York City. In my remarks at that ceremony, I told those present that we are not perfect and we are not free of the chains of prejudice, but that we are on our way. We have a plan of action that will, in the long run, show other communities what can be done when people unite in the name of simple justice for all. The award has been a light for us in our journey, and we hope a beacon for others. It helped us to see that the city government of Coeur d'Alene must continue to foster the basic freedoms and rights of individuals so that we may function without fear and trepidation in our daily lives. One of the actions taken by the Coeur d'Alene City Council was to vote unanimously to present the $5,000 Wallenberg Award to the city library to be used to establish a specialized section dedicated to those principles upon which Raoul Wallenberg lived during World War II. And very recently, in 1989, the city was also the recipient of the National Holocaust Committee's Award for our stand against racism. Another prestigious award. And this in itself, added to the Raoul Wallenberg, has given us all a light to follow in the future to establish those principles which we firmly believe here in the city of Coeur d'Alene, that justice and freedom must have grassroots as the established fact in the covering of those people who would do away with those freedoms in our own community.
Whereas both the Raoul Wallenberg and the city of, both Raoul Wallenberg and the city of Coeur d'Alene have demonstrated that love for our fellow man, without regard for racial or religious differences, and the acknowledgement that we are all children of God, are stronger than the evil which is inherent in either hatred or prejudice. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Executive Board of the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of the United States, on behalf of the committee's members throughout this nation, takes pride in presenting the Raoul Wallenberg Civic Award to the city of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, on the 14th day of January, 1987.
By all accounts, Raoul Wallenberg was a man of imagination and courage. The motivation behind his extraordinary efforts on behalf of Hungarian Jews can best be stated in his own words. He said, "Where there is suffering without limits, there can be no limits to the methods one should use to alleviate it.
The award money enabled us to establish a wonderful collection, the Human Rights Collection, which is housed in the Nelson Memorial Room at the Coeur d'Alene Public Library. At the time of its dedication, the collection contained 229 volumes, 76 of them for children. The collection continues to grow and has almost doubled in size now just through the generosity of people that live in the community. The books, which covered every facet of human rights and the actions and beliefs that threaten it, were comprised of original classic works on prejudice, ethnic minorities, small groups, large groups. It covered all of the feelings and the actions that people sometimes don't understand, and so we collected personal diaries, biographies, bibliographies, photographic documentation, even fiction to tell the story that needed to be told. The selections are made so that individuals could have the opportunity to learn how dangerous it was to try to deprive human beings of the rights that should be guaranteed to all. There was another purpose, the purpose to awaken memories and hearts and conscience. We included materials for children so that they could have a foundation to avoid the painful mistakes that the previous generation had made.
The shock and outrage at the attempted murder of the popular priest did much to solidify the human rights element throughout the entire state. It was now time for a major civil rights package to be introduced into the Idaho legislature. Dave Peters, a local public school teacher and then chair of the task force's legislative committee, and Tony Stewart, a political scientist at North Idaho College, recall those events.
The legislative committee was presented with the task of working with others to draft 3 major civil bills aimed at protection, prevention, and education. The first bill sought to provide a civil remedies amendment to the state's 1983 malicious harassment law that would aid victims of religious, racial, and ethnic harassment. The second bill, the Terrorist Act, sought to prohibit paramilitary training in Idaho, and the third bill would have established a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative day in the state. The Legislative Committee also agreed to support the Idaho Human Rights Commission's bill giving the commission subpoena power in civil rights cases. The rationale behind so much action at once was that it would be difficult to oppose such legislation in light of the terrorist acts of the order and the mood of the citizens following the bombings. Also, these violent acts were a clear illustration of the need for the legislation. The task force decided to move while the path was open.
The drafting of the legislation was very complicated and involved a number of experts from both political parties in the state of Idaho. Coeur d'Alene attorney Scott Reed, the husband of Senator Mary Lou Reed, conducted a 50-state research effort of civil remedies laws. Upon completing that research, he drafted the bill that was introduced by Senator Reed. We also had the Terrorist Control Act. It was decided early on in our efforts not to call it anti-paramilitary bill. It was developed with the excellent assistance of Idaho Governor John Evans' staff, along with Idaho Attorney General Jim Jones' staff, Kootenai County Prosecutor Glenn Walker, Coeur d'Alene Civil Rights Attorney Ray Givens, Dave Peters, the chair of the Task Force Legislative Committee, and myself. We then had the King Commemorative Day bill introduced. It was drafted by legislative staff under the direction of Senator Mary Lou Reed. The Idaho Human Rights Commission was responsible for the drafting of the subpoena bill for that session in 1987. And as you can see, all of these were bipartisan and well-informed groups that were helping with this package in the legislature in 1987. The next step involved the strategy for passage of these bills. The most crucial decision was the selection of the lobbyists that would represent the task force in Boise, Idaho. We agreed that our president, Catholic priest, Father Bill Wasmuth, would join with Louise Shattuck, a very prominent and well-respected Republican leader in the state of Idaho for many years. They joined forces to attend and testify for all the legislation that we have identified in this report.
It was a powerful and successful combination. It should be added that we had excellent and constant media coverage on a daily basis of our efforts during the 1987 session. Louise Shattuck also worked with the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Don Loveland. This was very critical to our efforts because it was a vital step in receiving the needed support in the House, which was much more difficult than the state Senate in the passage of the legislation.
The legislators from Kootenai County and members of the task force got together, strategized on just exactly what to do to make sure that a package of bills could be put through the legislature that would carry the message that Idaho was not going to become a haven for bigots. They tried to decide whether or not to put this bill through the House, another bill through the Senate. The decision was made to introduce first Martin Luther King Commemorative Day bill in the Senate. That went through, went over to the House. We also, in the Senate, introduced a bill that would deal with civil remedies against malicious harassment. So as a result of daily, almost daily conferences with members of the task force, the legislative session was very successful. I think that the seriousness of the bombings in Coeur d'Alene really had created the climate for the legislators from other parts of the state to be receptive, and they were receptive. They were very responsive. Most of those bills went through the Senate with a unanimous vote in favor. In further additional years, we were able to get through a bill that dealt with hate crimes reporting, and then very successful, and it was a great day for Idaho in 1990 when the legislature passed a bill which was not a commemorative day, it was a Martin Luther King Day holiday. In the general things that went the best were the strategizing between the task force and the legislators, and just the recognition that it was very important for the rest of the state to understand the seriousness of the situation. As a result, we really feel that we have one of the best packages of civil rights legislation in the whole country, and we hope to continue with that kind of a record.
The result of legislative efforts in 1983 and 1987 is that Idaho has the toughest anti-hate crime legislation in the country. The anti-malicious harassment law makes it a felony to harass anyone because of race, color, religion, or ethnic background. The civil penalties law allows a victim of harassment to sue for actual punitive damages and attorney's fees. The Terrorist Control Act makes it a felony to engage in paramilitary training in Idaho with a hefty prison term and fines. Task Force member Larry Broadbent asked me to build on these legislative successes. The Uniform Bias Crime Reporting Bill was introduced in the House but failed in the Senate. It became law after reintroduction in 1989 by Senator Reed. The law requires law enforcement to report crimes based on race, color, or national origin. The task force legislative goals were reached when Governor Andrus in his 1990 State of the State message called for the establishment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Day. Senator Reed sponsored the bill. It became law in April 1990.
A signing ceremony for Senate Bill 1348 was held in Boise, but celebrations were held statewide. From Boise, Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus talked to a Coeur d'Alene gathering via the telephone.
Coeur d'Alene, North Idaho, is a significant reason for the passage of this legislation. A lot of people, Tony Stewart, whom you mentioned, Bill Wasmuth, and others who, yourself and others, who fought off the bigotry that some people tried to paint upon the face of North Idaho. You've done an outstanding job, and I appreciate it.
The success in the legislature showed that the people of Idaho would not retreat in fear before the threat that lived within her boundaries. The task force had secured for itself a reputation for courage, action, and persistence. This time, there was no thought to resting on their laurels. The task force knew that if their victories were to stand, they must remain ever active, ever vigilant. In 1990, the city of Coeur d'Alene was presented another prestigious award. The National League of Cities voted Coeur d'Alene one of the 10 winners in the 41st Annual All-America City Award competition sponsored by the Allstate Foundation. The award is given in recognition of community efforts to solve current problems. A key factor in the selection of Coeur d'Alene as an All-America city was the community's stand in advocating human rights. This was the stand led by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations.
The most significant impact of the new focus by the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations has been a growing public awareness of the wrongs of prejudice and the destructive nature of hatred and bigotry. We knew that one of our tasks would be to continue this public awareness. An example was the All-American City Award for Coeur d'Alene in 1990, which brought attention to our cause and a public awareness of the human rights movement in our city. Another way in which we reached beyond the limits of our community was in assisting other communities throughout the Northwest in the creation of similar task forces in their communities when they faced such threats of hatred. One such example was the founding of the Sanders County Task Force for Human Dignity in the neighboring state of Montana. A delegation from our task force went to that county and were treated like royalty. We came away with very good feelings of the people of Montana and Sanders County and knew that their future would be bright. One of the things that has been especially exciting for me, and that occurred as a spinoff of the 1986 Human Rights Celebration in the city park of Coeur d'Alene, was the idea of developing a regional human rights organization. It was my privilege in the year 1986 to contact Kootenai County Task Force President Bill Wasmuth, who had had the idea of the celebration of the park, and to suggest to him and also the chair of the Task Force Community Response Committee, Mr. Marshall Mend, the idea of a 5-state human rights group. After much work, Bob Hughes, who is with the United States Justice Department in Seattle, joined with us in putting together a 17-member steering committee for the purpose of looking at this plan. Those steering committee members came from the states of Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And after much dedication and success in writing bylaws, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment was established on April the 3rd, 1987, and the signing took place on the campus of North Idaho College. This civil rights corporation is providing a number of very valuable services throughout the region of the Northwest, including an annual conference in which people come from throughout the Northwest and around the country to talk about ways of eradicating prejudice and bigotry. There is also a monitoring committee within the organization that does quarterly and annual reports about incidents of malicious harassment and violence throughout the Northwest. There is a community response section of the organization to help communities deal with bigotry. There is educational services working with primary, secondary, and higher education institutions, as well as with the general public. There is also a victim support section that works with individuals and organizations that have faced bigotry in the Northwest. Another exciting activity of the Kootenai County Task Force took place in April 1989. At the time that the Aryan Nations were having their first racist skinhead conference at their compound outside of Hayden Lake, the Kootenai County Task Force put together a whole week entitled the Human Rights Week here in the county of Kootenai. During that week, we started with a celebration of the 20th birthday of the Idaho Human Rights Commission. The governor was present, as well as the executive director of that commission, and also the state senator who had brought about the bill 20 years ago. We invited children from the public schools, and we had hundreds of children teaching them how to celebrate the birthday of the Human Rights Commission. One of our visual aids was a 20-long-foot cake that the children enjoyed at the end of the ceremony. Also that week, we distributed 6,000 orange ribbons throughout the county. They were on buildings, on cars, and people were wearing them to send a message to those who are visiting our county and dealing in hate, that we would reject that hate and that we would work for human rights. The ribbons sent that message. We also had a picnic for human rights in an adjoining small town called Rathdrum, Idaho, on that Saturday at the end of the week. And then we closed the week on Sunday with an interfaith service with the Jewish community and the Christian community from the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene areas joining in hundreds of individuals celebrating the rights and dignity of all persons, of all religions and non-religions, and of all races and colors. When the first 10 years of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations is reviewed by Northwest historians, it is my belief that the task force's most lasting contribution will probably be listed as our educational efforts throughout those 10 years to the general public as well as to the public school systems and colleges and universities of our area. These educational efforts have been extensive and have included many activities, including plans for the elimination of prejudice and bigotry through teaching of a curriculum in our schools of the wrongs of bigotry. A second effort has been the Dr. Martin Luther King celebration that I discussed earlier with you, when we have thousands of people during those 2 or 3 days to come together to understand human rights through the teachings of that great leader, Dr. King. We have also sponsored PBS programs, now over 30, that have been broadcast throughout the Northwest, talking about the principles of justice, equality, and freedom. In addition to that, we've held a number of workshops and symposiums and seminars. One was a week-long symposium on the problems of racism, with leaders from many ethnic and minority communities around the country joining us in that symposium. In addition to that, we've had numerous appearances as task force members before Northwest organizations and institutions, speaking to them about our principles and our work for equality. We have also used public service announcements on radio and local media from such effective organizations as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith that they have shared with us. We have also developed a number of materials that are used by people in our region. In addition to that, we have held press conferences and press releases for the purpose of speaking out and looking at all of society as a classroom in which we can talk about what we believe to be the right way for all people in this world to work and live together. And at the end of the first decade of the task force, as we're taping this program, we have had our first youth camp on human rights, composed of children from the Spokane and Coeur d'Alene areas. Therefore, I would conclude that in the end, the work of the task force will be recorded as the proper path to take in the dignity of human relationships.
The work begun by 15 not-so-ordinary citizens of an ordinary rural county in northern Idaho continues today. Some of the faces have changed, but the commitment remains the same. Success hasn't been measured by the constancy of individual task force membership, but rather by the overwhelming number of people who consistently stand together in times of trouble. The members of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations have learned much during the last 10 years. Much of what they have learned has been organizational and mundane. They meet more frequently than ever before. There is more structure to the organization and to the work that it does. They know they must never relax their efforts again. Other lessons are more profound, harder to grasp. They have learned that when a handful of people stand up to an evil within their midst, that the American spirit still lives. The handful becomes 100. They have learned that the roots of bigotry and prejudice are deep, and that there is still much to be done before there is a generation of children to whom hate groups are just a part of history.